Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the True North Report, news that every Canadian needs to know. And I want to welcome everyone into the new year, 2019. So today we're going to be touching on mostly stories that ended up happening since the new year has come around. Maybe one or two just talking about some stories from 2018, but I'm going to be starting off today talking about something that made the rounds on social media over the last week because it's quite controversial. It turns out that in late 2018, and really what only gained attention in 2019, beginning of 2019, is the fact that there's a new party that has been established in Ontario, and that party is the Islamic Party of Ontario. And it's quite concerning the type of things that the Islamic Party wants to do. This here is their website where they end up talking about their principles and policies. Now, they've only just really gotten themselves started off the ground. I think it was only within the new year that Elections Ontario gave them the right to begin registration for their party. But they're trying to build themselves up so that way they can run in the next election, which would be in about 2022, I believe. It'd be about 2022 when the next election comes around, and by then, the Islamic Party of Ontario will probably have members, MPPs, who'd be able to run in the election. Now, I encourage everyone to go through and take a look at their platform, because the things that they want to do is, well, without sugarcoating it, they want to implement Sharia law in Ontario. They haven't actually used the term Sharia law in this when they're talking about it, but it's quite clear that through what they're wording, that this is what they want to do. They talk about how the laws can only be dictated by the Quran, and that's the way they're going to implement them. And in doing so, they're going to undermine a lot of our rights and freedoms that we take here for granted. So there's a few things about this that I want to bring up. Is that number one is that they talk about certain things that we already allow in Ontario, such as gay marriage. That would be something that was taken out. They deem it that marriage is only between a man and a woman, so that way they would no longer allow it. They're trying to literally bring in, from the Middle East, a lot of their policies. And this is what I was talking about, maybe it was one episode ago or two, where I was talking about the Islamization of Canada. And this is what's going on right now. I'm going to get into in just a moment, but there is a post that was put online about the 4 stages of Islamic conquest over a nation and how it goes about. And even though this is just something that I found that was on, it was called Civil U.S. Defendus. It's just a blog, but I think if we read through the 4 stages, it seems pretty clear that this is exactly how things have been playing out here in Canada. It's the way things have been playing out all over European countries where they've welcomed in big groups of Islamic immigrants. And it has to go with establishing blasphemy laws in those countries. Then it moves on to more political conquest, and it talks about how trying to undermine the rules, the laws, the freedoms that are available in those countries. So this is a real threat to Canada, the new Islamic Party of Ontario. Now, again, right now it's just a provincial party, so it's not like it'll affect the rest of Canada. But this sort of thing has a tendency to spread. So I believe for sure that if this ends up getting established and they even gain some power here in Ontario, that we're going to see this spread to other countries around the world, other provinces around Canada, is what I meant to say. That this isn't going to just remain here. I believe Quebec would probably be one of the next provinces that would see a party like this get established, because they too have a large population of Islamic people. Now, the thing is too, is Muslims are actually a pretty small minority here in Canada in comparison to the bigger population and other groups that we have around. So the fact that this group has been managed to get this much support, this much power over such a short amount of time with such a small population is saying something, especially when we saw the introduction of things such as M103. When we have someone like Omar Al-Ghabra, and we also have someone like Iqra Khalid, these are people that, at least quite clearly, through Iqra Khalid, can be connected back to groups such as the Muslim Brotherhood, it's quite concerning because this is exactly what I think the Islamic Party of Ontario is for. It's a group that's not necessarily going to be there to advocate for Muslims for themselves, but I think you'd find a lot of Muslims who'd be in support of this party. It more has to do with the extremist groups who they're going to advocate for. So I highly recommend that everybody take a look through. They say some ridiculous things, such as they talk about this the dean, which you can see a little bit throughout. And as they kind of explain, Dean is a system of life, and they at one point in this they say that they believe that the native Dean of Ontario and Canada is Islam. So pretty much talking about how apparently Islam is supposed to be the right culture, the right the right religion here in Canada, even though Canada only recently, over the last couple decades, has started to gain an Islamic population. They for some reason they seem to think that this is the native culture of Canada. And this is the problem with Islam, is that Islam is not just a religion, but it's a culture. It's a political system. When you have things such as Sharia law, which demands that the laws be structured around the way that it is built, it is said in the Quran, then this is a threat to every single Canadian here. They want to outlaw things such as smoking. They want to outlaw things such as alcohol. They want to outlaw nudity. And going even to much more vague territory, they say things like they want to outlaw obscenity. Well, obscenity is it's a very vague way to describe something. I mean, what is considered obscenity to one person or the other? So if the Islamic Party of Ontario ends up gaining any sort of power, they're going to definitely overrule what we hold dear here in Canada. And they also talk about how they're not a capitalist and they're not a communist party, but it's quite clear both of who they support and also the stuff they talk about in this thing here, the principles and policies. It's quite clear that they are a much more socialist party. See, this is something I've kind of noticed when it comes to Islam, is that Islam is a very conservative, traditionalist society culturally, but when it comes to sort of economically, they're much more socialist. They want those handouts. And it's quite clear because there was even an article that was put out by Post Millennial, which was talking about the leader of the Islamic Party of Ontario. It says, Islamic Party of Ontario founder offered Wynne his support if she changed her sexuality. This ended up coming out on January 6th, 2019. And this kind of makes me laugh because Wynne, like many other liberals, were the champions of groups such as the Muslim groups in Canada. And then we have a founder who was willing to support her, but he couldn't support her because she was a lesbian. And Wynne was one of those people that was going around talking about how, how terrible it is for Muslims to be treated the way they are. Islamophobia is on the rise. Racism is on the rise. But then meanwhile, they treated her like a second-class citizen whenever she went to these areas. I think it was about late last year, in about December of 2017, there was an article about Wynne where she full out said this. She was speaking at a mosque, and she says how Islamophobia and racism are on the rise. Now, the thing about this that I thought was funny is, first of all, they had her wearing a hijab while she was there, even though it's not part of her religion or personal points of view, but she still wore the hijab. The other thing that was kind of funny about it was the fact that they actually segregated her from the other areas until they had her come up to speak. You see pictures of her where she's sitting alone in a chair because she was not allowed to be around the other people, be around the men, pretty much. So I thought this was quite funny for somebody who likes to talk about racism, sexism, Islamophobia. She was defending them while they treated her like a second-class citizen. But if we look at the policies that was trying to be put forth by the Wynne government, we can see how this was exactly, we can see how Wynne was very hardcore left-wing. Some people would even consider her a socialist, or at least pushing for socialist policies. And now we are having the leader of the Islamic Party of Ontario, who was saying that the only reason he didn't support her was because of her sexuality. So it was nothing against her policies, It had nothing to do with the handouts. It had nothing to do with the universal basic income that you want to offer throughout all of Ontario. It was simply because she was a lesbian. And it says here, the founder of Islamic Party of Ontario, Jawed Anwar, published a letter in 2013 openly arguing the then recently elected Premier of Ontario to find a change of heart and soul by becoming heterosexual. Perhaps most bizarrely, the letter states that Mr. Anwar would gladly become a devout liberal if Kathleen Wynne actually switched her sexual orientation, all this while making a derogatory statement about fellow Muslims. And this is part of the letter. It says, Ms. Kathleen Wynne, I pray for you for the change of heart and soul. If you change yourself, you will find me your biggest supporter, a full-time volunteer without asking any worldly reward in return. I am not looking for any job in your constituency and Queen's Park office, as are most of your Muslim supporters. And he puts Muslim in quotation marks. So, two things about this, when we're talking about the Islamic Party of Ontario, is first of all, for anybody who watches the YouTube channel Derek Rants, or probably if you type, you're more likely to find it if you put in Rants Derek in the YouTube search, he's talked about the Islamic Party of Ontario, or IPOO, as he put it, if you use the acronym IPOO, IPOO. So that is just too perfect right there. The other thing is this man, Jawed Anwar, and sort of his history. See, the way that this started making the rounds was because Tariq Fatah ended up coming out on Twitter talking about it, and also put out an article in the Toronto Sun where he was talking about this. But he talked about how he was threatened by this man, by Jawed Anwar, and the way he was threatened was because back when Faith Goldie was running for to become mayor of Toronto, she ended up campaigning with the well-known Zionist Laura Loomer. Laura Loomer came to Canada, and she ended up protesting outside a Muslim, it was like some Muslim get-together or something like that. They ended up protesting, the two of them together. And in an article that was written by Jawed Anwar, or at least a blog post of some kind, he ended up talking about how that Tariq Fatah wrote an article talking about the protest that was done by Laura Loomer and Faith Goldie. And in that article, he called Tariq Fatah an enemy of Islam. And in doing so, he pretty much labeled Tariq Fatah up an apostate. And we all know what tends to happen to apostates when it comes to Islam. I mean, we have the Pew polls that were put out there, which talks about how many Muslims around the world from different countries believe that things such as death for leaving the religion is an acceptable practice. I mean, I think in some places like Egypt, it was as high as like 90%, where they ended up discussing that it was okay for somebody an apostate, someone leaving the religion, to be killed. So there's concerns such as this that we end up having to have. So this is one thing about him. He's already made pretty much an open threat against Tariq Fatah, and Tariq Fatah has already been threatened by other countries, other Muslim-dominated countries around the world. So this is very concerning when you have someone inside of your country who is trying to come into a position of power. And, being the leader of the province it's not any small amount of power. You might not be in the federal politics, but you have enough power over all the province. So the fact that this could be a threat to Tariq Fatah. Now, I was discussing a little bit earlier about the 4 stages of Islamic conquest throughout a nation and how it ends up going down. Now, we're going to go through some of these points, and I want you to bear in mind things that you've seen here in Canada and things you've seen around the world in countries such as Europe, like European countries, whether that be France, UK, Sweden, Belgium, Germany, and all these other ones that have taken a mass amount of migrants, and see if you can find a comparison that ends up happening here. Excuse me just for one sec. So this is it here, and we have 4 stages, and the first stage is infiltration. Muslims begin moving to non-Muslim countries in increased numbers, and the beginning of cultural conflicts are visible through, though often subtle. First, migration wave to non-Muslim host countries. Appeal for humanitarian tolerance from the host countries. Attempts to portray Islam as a peaceful and Muslims as victim of misunderstanding and racism, even though Islam is not a race. Now, we see this all over about how Islam is actually the religion of peace, yet despite this, we have countless examples of how it's not a religion of peace, about how it actually brings with it a lot of violence. Now, this maybe that has something to do. You know what? I'm not going to say maybe. What I think it is that it has two parts of it. It has to do with what is written in the Quran, and then we also got to look at the IQ differences of people that come from Middle Eastern countries, because we already know that things such as low IQ bring with it the more tendency to commit crime, to commit violence, to be less tolerant to other people. And I think these are two of the problems. They have their doctrine, which states that this is the way the world has to work and this is the way that these Muslims have to live their life by. And then on top of that, we have the low IQ, which was most likely going to allow them to engage in acts such as violence. But we've seen this. We've seen how it's a religion of peace, and how Muslims are just misunderstood, and it's racism. That's the reason why. Islamophobia is a perfect example of that. High Muslim birth rates in host countries increase Muslim population. We're seeing this in Canada right now. I would say that whenever I see a mother and father with the most amount of children with them, they always seem to be Muslim. And this can be 3, 4, 5, 6 kids sometimes even. 1 second. Mosques used to spread Islam and dislike of host countries and culture. Calls to criminalize Islamophobia as hate crime. We have M103, which proves that this ends up being the case, and we also have enough video footage from imams and mosques where they're talking about the degeneracy of Western culture and Canada and the U.S. and all these sort of things. So we're seeing this. Threatened legal action for perceived discrimination. Offers an interfaith dialogue to indoctrinate non-Muslims. So now we go into stage 2, consolidation of power. Proselytizing increases, establishment and recruitment of jihadi cells. Well, we're seeing some of this right now because we see how we had enough people when ISIS was at its height. We had enough Canadians that went over to fight for ISIS. And then on top of that, we had a number of ISIS terrorists come back to Canada, and they're actually being invited in by our federal government right now. Efforts to convert alienated segments of the population to Islam, and this so we can look at the prison system right now, and how many people that go into prison end up getting converted to Islam, and they become foot guards for these Islamic gangs that are available on our streets. Revisionist efforts to Islamize history. Well, we can go back to what they ended up saying in the Islamic Party of Ontario principles, where they say that Islam is the native deen of both Ontario and Canada. Efforts to destroy historic evidence that reveal true Islamism. Increase anti-Western propaganda and psychological warfare. Efforts to recruit allies who share similar goals, communists, anarchists. We have the Liberal Party of Canada right now that is doing this work for them. And we also have, we saw how it was the Liberal Party of Ontario was doing a lot of the same thing. These people will, and they do it because of the discrimination Olympics, pretty much. They play, like, these groups of people, like the progressives, who play off and just talk about how history, culture is incredibly racist, and therefore certain groups of people are more oppressed than others. And this is exactly what a lot of these Islamists play into. Attempts to indoctrinate children to Islamist viewpoints. And I think this doesn't have to be just children, but it can be the population itself. Remember the Women's March that took place in America, about how they were trying to present the hijab as some sort of feminist symbol. It's like you put it on and you're empowered now. Well, it's completely contradictory to what we're seeing around the world. We've over more than a year now, we've been seeing about the protests that are going on in Iran, by Muslim women who are taking off their hijabs because they're just so pissed off with the way that they are being oppressed over there. And because of it, people, like a lot of these women are getting arrested. Some of them have died in prison and have suffered horrific crimes while in prison, such as rape. Increased efforts to intimidate, silence, and eliminate non-Muslims. We're seeing this through our government legislation, but also the people who are involved in government, whether it happens to be Ahmed Hussein, Justin Trudeau, Gerald Butts, Iqra Khalid, Omar Al-Ghabra, or many, many more. They're doing exactly this, and we have M103 that shows this. Efforts to introduce blasphemy and hate laws in order to silence critics, M103. Continue to focus on enlarging Muslim population by increasing Muslim birth and immigration. Well, this is almost explicitly what's ended up happening, especially when we're talking about immigration underneath the Trudeau government. We've seen how a number of the immigrants who are coming to Canada, first they've increased the immigrants, but then they're also bringing them from Muslim-dominated cultures. I mean, it's absolutely unbelievable these days. Covert efforts to bring about the destruction of host society from within, develop Muslim political base in non-Muslim host countries, Islamic Party of Ontario. Islamic financial networks fund political growth, acquisition of land. And this is when I was talking about the Islamization of Canada an episode or two ago. This is exactly what we ended up seeing about how certain areas were being taken over by Muslims. And this is a good example was Fort McMurray, because we end up seeing how one of the largest mosques in the world is being built there, and there's a huge population of Muslims who are over there. We also have the Green Belt down in Brantford, the Toronto area, sort of around there, where that is one of our most fertile grounds to grow food in Canada, in North America, and maybe even some of the most fertile lands in all over the world. And that is being taken over as well. So we're seeing acquisition of land. Tolerance of non-Muslims diminishes, greater demand to adopt strict Islamic conduct. Clandestine amassing of weapons and explosives at hidden locations. And I know we can see this in places such as Germany, because there's been many mosques that have been raided by local police forces there, and they found stockpiles of weapons, things such as AK-47s, and I mean dozens of them, sometimes hundreds of them, that are being held in these mosques there. So that's pretty much summing up Stage 2. Stage 3, open warfare with leadership and culture. Intentional efforts to undermine the host government and culture. Well, this is what we're seeing too. This is beginning. I think we're somewhere between Stage 2 and Stage 3 here in Canada, because when we see about like they're undermining the host government and culture, it's not so much that they're undermining the government right now, they're undermining the culture. And they do this when they try and say, we want to ban smoking, when we want to ban alcohol, when we want to ban nudity, things such as this. It's just the fact that this is something we've allowed in our society. Even if they're not great things, it's more about the freedom to allow people to do them, and now they're trying to undermine these exact things. Acts of barbarity to intimidate citizens and foster fear and submission. I think from what we saw from Eid Mubarak, where we were seeing animals that, this was happening in Canada too, where there were animals that were being slaughtered and then they were being skinned. This is the sort of thing we have to we can discuss, because I know that there were several videos that ended up coming out from Canada where people were in their backyard just skinning the animals right there. Now, that's pretty barbaric, and there's actually laws in place for how you have to slaughter an animal and how you have to take care of the meat, and these were violating all these laws, yet you didn't hear about one police investigation, you didn't hear about one police arrest for violating these laws, or at least a fine of some sort. These were completely went underneath the radar. Open and covert efforts to cause economic collapse of the society. All opposition is challenged and either eradicated or silenced. Mass execution of non-Muslims. Widespread ethnic cleansing of Islamic militias. Rejection and defiance of host society, secular laws, or cultures. Murder of moderate Muslim intellectuals who don't support Islamization. So we're not seeing some of the more extreme things on here, such as mass execution of non-Muslims or widespread ethnic cleansing, but we are seeing things such as we're seeing the rejection and defiance of host society, secular laws, or culture. We're seeing not necessarily the murder of moderate Muslim intellectuals who don't support Islamization, but we are seeing how they are now being threatened because of it. We see this through what happened to Tariq Fatah, and I don't know if many people know her, but it's what was her name? One Godless Woman, I think, or One Godless Muslim on Twitter and also on YouTube. She's an ex. She used to be from Saudi Arabia, I think. I think she moved to Canada, and she's an ex-Muslim now. But she's been threatened by other Islamists because of the fact that she speaks out against Islam. Destruction of churches, synagogues, and other non-Muslim institutions. We've seen this too in Europe right now, where we're seeing that churches end up getting attacked. A good example of this was a few years ago was on New Year's Eve to New Year's Day. In Germany, there was something like over 1,000 women that were sexually assaulted, and this was all done by gangs of immigrants that had come to the country, and they were also attacking churches in that area. I don't think they burned any down or anything like that, but they were throwing stones and rocks. They broke some windows and things, so they were violating what were considered non-Muslim institutions. Women are restricted further in accordance with Sharia law, large-scale destruction of population, assassination, bombing. We are starting to see that there's more terrorist attacks that are happening here in Canada. Slowly and slowly, we have Edmonton that ended up happening. We ended up having, oh, you know what? I was going to say the Toronto attack, but apparently that was an incel. Apparently. Whether that's true or not, I'm not sure. But we are seeing how there's a lot more people who are coming to Canada, such as Islamic fighters, who have the ability to commit these terrorist attacks. Imposition of Sharia law. And we're starting to see that through the Islamic Party of Ontario. And then the final one, totalitarian Islamic theocracy. Sharia becomes law of the land. All non-Islamic human rights canceled, enslavement and genocide of non-Muslim populations, freedom of speech and the press eradicated, all religions other than Islam are forbidden and destroyed, destruction of all evidence of non-Muslim culture, population, and symbols in country, Buddhas, house of worship, art, etc. So some of these examples that were given are quite extreme, but I think that for the most part, the four different stages that were laid out are pretty consistent with what we've seen, especially if we're talking about stage 1 and stage 2. Now, I do want to press that I think it's wrong to just assume that every single Muslim thinks this way or is acting this way, but there is a large portion of the population, the Muslim population, that is pushing for this. These are jihadis. These are Islamists. These aren't people that came to integrate, but they're coming to slowly take over. And this is exactly what I think we're seeing in our country, and is actually being supported by the current Liberal Party of Ontario. Liberal Party of Canada, I should say. So, it's something to keep our eyes on for sure. Now let's move on to a different story. What I wanted to talk about now is Doug Ford was. Hold on, I got a video that I want to make. I want to see if it'll work. I've had these tabs open for a while. Anyway. Come on. Anyway, what I want to talk about was Doug Ford, because we voted in Doug Ford in our previous election. Dr. Catherine. There we go. We voted in Doug Ford in our last election in order to make changes to Ontario, because we were unhappy with the way that things were going, and this had to do with massive spending, deficits, healthcare, things such as this. Now, we've been seeing the changes made, and I've been happy with some of those changes. I've said before, I want to see more out of the man than just cuts. And things such as healthcare was something that I actually had high expectations with the man for. I had high expectations because I know that his mother was just recently in the hospital, and that she was subjected to hallway healthcare. So I was waiting to see for him to make changes to this. But there is a group called Your Ontario Doctors, Concerned Ontario Doctors, I should say. And they campaigned hard during the previous election in favor of Doug Ford over Kathleen Wynne, and many people will probably remember them because Kathleen Wynne stole their slogan, because they've campaigned for a long time over the hashtag care not cuts, and then Kathleen Wynne ended up taking that. Then she ended up switching it when she got some lashback to care over cuts. So she was clearly aware of this group and what they were advocating for, but she ignored them. And now we're seeing something similar that's happening with Doug Ford. We're seeing how he came on, he took the support from these groups, and then now he hasn't done anything yet. Now it's still within the first year, but by now we should see some changes that are going on in our healthcare to make it better. These are frontline doctors and nurses that have come together to try and alert people to the extreme problems that we have right now when it comes to our healthcare, because our healthcare is one of the worst in the developed world. We have universal healthcare, and there's plenty of other countries that have universal healthcare, but in Canada, our universal healthcare is one of the worst. So we're going to take a quick look into what they have to say on the subject. And as they say here, it says Ford government, like Wynn's failed government, is only engaging with Ontario health bureaucrats, not frontline medical doctors. His healthcare council is made entirely of bureaucrats, even including some of the very architects of our current healthcare crisis. So that's saying a lot, because this was one of their big arguments against Kathleen Wynne, was the fact that they were only dealing with the bureaucrats, not the doctors themselves, who could tell you the real problems that were being faced. And now Ford is doing the exact same thing. So let's listen to what they have to say.
Walker, and I'm a family physician in Cambridge, Ontario. Premier Ford ran on a platform of working for the people. When I make promises, I keep them, period. I won't make reckless promises. His promises to the people of Ontario are broken in the first 6 months. It's time that Premier Ford acts on those words. He said, "We will listen to the frontline medical professionals, including nurses and doctors, to ensure that there is long-term, stable funding available to do the capacity planning that our healthcare deserves." Premier Ford also called for the end of hallway medicine. His newly appointed health minister, Christine Elliott, her first order of business was to focus on this task. Their first step in this direction, they said, was to listen to the people working in healthcare, providing care to those patients every day. Premier Ford and Minister Elliott continued to say that they were listening to the front lines, but none of this appears to be true. In fact, multiple requests by frontline physicians in concerned Ontario doctors have requested to meet and discuss the solutions to our healthcare crisis, and have sent multiple missives to Premier Ford's office, Minister Elliott's office as well, and the office of her 2 assistants, MPPs. All requests over the past 6 months have been completely ignored. Promises made and promises broken. Premier Ford's government, like Wynn's failed government before it, is again only engaging with healthcare bureaucrats, not frontline physicians or nurses. This is most clear in the composition of the Health Quality Ontario Council created by Ford's government. This was created to end hallway medicine and transform the system. The council is made entirely of bureaucrats. It even includes some of the very architects of our current crisis, some linked with the Liberal e-health scandal, others who contributed to hallway healthcare themselves, some who advocated for the loss of physicians' freedom of conscience, and others who supported further expansion of the wasteful LHINs. The special advisor of the council is none other than Dr. Ruben Devlin, the leader behind the first fully digital health system, Humber Regional Hospital. Within days of Humber opening, Dr. Devlin and his administration were off to a very difficult start. Capacity was a problem from day one. They were finding innovations and solutions, all right. As many as 97 beds in the brand new facility were in what their own administration called unconventional spaces. Dr. Devlin's current mission statement as council leader and chair includes wanting to build organizational capacity and ensuring Ontario's healthcare system is family and patient-centered. He plans to unlock innovation in the system. His first report, however, is due in January, yet we have not heard about any genuine open consultation with frontline physicians. COD has reached out to no avail. Input has been sought from only a select few from the very hospitals and universities that the council members are affiliated with. Is this the system transformation that we truly need? Again, promises made and promises broken. OHIP Plus is another area of concern. The PC party themselves were critical of it when it was introduced by the Liberals. Minister Urick, PC health critic at the time, was very vocal regarding his concerns with the plan, even suggesting it was little more than an attempt to buy votes. A huge concern with OHIP Plus was that it shifted the cost of drug coverage from existing private plans to the government funding model. This shift further taxed an already underfunded system. Now fast forward to this past summer, when on June 30th, newly minted Health Minister Christine Elliott announced her intent to fix the flaws of OHIP Plus. She would make it secondary coverage, while finding ways to focus on helping those who did not have coverage. While we were very encouraged by this news, it's now December 4th, months later, and the bleeding of healthcare dollars through OHIP Plus continues. The cost of this program was underestimated by the Liberals at $445 million annually. In fact, the estimate is now closer to $848 million, plus $234 million for EAP coverage. That's over $1 billion a year. $1 billion out of a system that is already in crisis. Another promise made, another promise broken. Premier Ford's government is focusing on the symptoms of a problem and not addressing the root cause of the crisis. Hallway medicine is a symptom of a failing healthcare system due to lack of adequate funding for the frontline doctors and specialists within our communities. It is time to fix the road instead of continuing to patch the holes. Lack of family physicians, support at home, lack of accessible palliative care, ballooning wait lists, these are all symptoms of the greater problem.
So we see there from frontline doctors the real problem that we have here in Ontario. And we see how it's mostly one of the main problems is lack of staff and underfunding. In fact, by her numbers, they need more than 100% more funding. They're receiving $445 million, I believe she said, and we need about $1 billion just to make ends meet in our system. We need a big radical change to the way that we do healthcare here in Ontario, because we have some of the problems that lead up to hallway healthcare is the fact that there's not a good amount of support for small problems that Ontarians have to go to the hospital for little things. I mean, first of all, if you don't have to go to the hospital, don't. I mean, if you just have a cold and you want to see a doctor, then just take some medicine and get over it. Because this is what I see too when I'm at the hospital, is I see people there for bullshit diseases, bullshit reasons, but they're taking up the space that is needed by everyone else. At the same time, they're wasting their day. They're wasting their day waiting in hospital for a small disease and possibly going to get other people sick just because they have the common cold or something. What you need is bed rest. What you need is to take some time to recover and you'll be fine. But I remember, like, when we look at sort of like the health clinics that are around Ottawa, around Ontario, when we look at the health clinics that are around Ontario, things such as the Apple Tree Medical Centers, they're so inconsistent with when doctors are going to be there, when you can get healthcare, that people wait for a long freaking time for little things. And like, I remember a few years ago, I got a cut on my finger that got infected, and it ballooned up to maybe 2, maybe even 3 times the size of my finger should have been. So it was the middle of the day, it was maybe noon, 1 o'clock, and I walked into one of those facilities, and there was no doctor there. No doctor, And I had to go all the way to the hospital just to get treated by this, when all I really needed was to go to have someone take a quick look at it, clean it out, and then maybe give me some antibiotics or something like that in order to make sure that I'd be fine. Should have been something that should have been available through something like the apple tree, but there was nobody there. There has also been a couple other times where I've been pretty sick. One time I was there because I was having a really hard time breathing, and it turned out I had a minor form of pneumonia. I showed up when it was supposed to open, which was about 8 a.m. or no, you know what? It was supposed to open at 8 a.m. I showed up at 9 a.m. There was no doctor there. There were already people there waiting. There was no doctor there. There was no doctor for another hour and a half, 2 hours. And then, so you already waited just for the doctor to show up. And then you still had to wait even longer in order to, you had to wait even longer as they went through all the different people before they finally get to you. By the time I was done there, I probably waited for 5 hours almost just to get myself treated. These are some of the problems that we have. So this needs to be taken care of. This is something that Doug Ford was elected for. One of the main reasons. I mean, yes, we also elected him on balanced budgets. We elected him to make cuts to our system so that way we can have balanced budgets and we don't have a ballooning debt. But there was more than that than we demanded, and this is something that they're not doing. They're going through the other political process. People wanted Doug Ford because he seemed like he was going to be different than other politicians, that he would talk to the people, which he does. I mean, I'll give the guy credit. He's given out his phone number to thousands of Ontarians who have a direct line to him. I mean, I personally have sent him messages on Twitter and gotten responses. Now, it's possible that this was not from Doug Ford himself, but people who are running his Twitter account. I believe at the time it was Doug Ford because this was right as he was coming in to campaign for the leadership. So he replied, and I'm pretty sure it was him. And many people have said they've had conversations with him, whether online or they've called his cell phone and he's picked up and they've talked to him. So I give him credit for that. But we need more than this. We need him to start fulfilling more of his promises. And again, we know that the guy is getting a lot of flack, a lot of lashback from people. I mean, groups have tried to take him to court for the most dumbest things ever. Greenpeace is trying to sue him for canceling the cap and trade and trying to cancel the carbon tax. And they're trying to act like it's against our constitution or something like that. They make bullshit accusations against him, such as how he's meddling in elections when he tries to downsize he tries to downsize Toronto City Council, which he actually was a member on Toronto City Council. So I'm pretty sure that when he says that there's a lot of unnecessary people in there and just a lot of meat that can be cut down, I believe him when he says that because he's been in there. The thing is, though, is that when you try and make the claim against the man that he is trying to meddle in elections, and that is against, I think they said Section 2 of the Canadian Charter, which is the freedom of expression of both the politicians and the voters, that to me was just a load of crap. But we want more. We voted on him for more. We want more. And it's time for Doug Ford and other people to deliver on that. Okay. And, right. Last thing when talking about healthcare is this that I'm coming across my desk a couple of days ago, and it's quite concerning about what they're trying to advocate. It's a CBC article. It came out on January 3rd. And what it says here is, hold on, let me get that a little more. There we go. The next frontier in the right to die. Advanced requests, minors, and the mentally ill. Expanding access to medically assisted assistance in death pits advocates against religious groups. Canadians are walking into new territory on the right to die, commencing a debate over whether Parliament should allow minors and the mentally ill to end their lives with the help of a doctor. Just days before breaking for the holiday, the Liberal government received 3 expert panel reports from the Council of Canadian Academies, which looked at the possibility of extending medical assistance in dying to mature minors, people under the age of 18 considered by doctors be capable of directing their own care, people with psychiatric conditions, and those making requests in advance. The reports don't offer specific recommendations, but are intended to guide discussions around the potential legislative changes. Now, here's the thing about something. When it comes to the idea, like, since we have the medically assisted suicide in Canada, when it comes to people making an advanced request, I think this should be something that may be considered acceptable. For the reason is that I have family that work in the healthcare industry. And they've said before that, especially with people in palliative care, people who are going to die, sometimes by the time they're at the point where they can make the decision, like people who are going to make the decision for medically assisted suicide, by the time they reach that point, especially if they suffer from something like dementia, when they suffer from this, by the time they can make that decision, it's too late because they're too gone mentally that they cannot make that decision anymore, and then they're forced to suffer out the rest of their life. So I think this is something that's at least worth considering. But the idea of the mentally ill and minors being allowed this is just a disastrous policy, especially the minors of all people. Because we already see how there is a problem with people who are underage, teenagers that attempt to commit suicide. But now we're going to give them a path to actually follow through with that suicide, which is disastrous. Most people that end up thinking at one point in their life that they want to commit suicide, when they stay strong and hold out, they actually change their minds later on in life. Most people, a large, significant majority of people who have considered suicide and stick it through, actually say that they're really glad that they didn't. And it's very, very rare where somebody will then still go on to try and commit suicide. But now we're going to give them a path, an easy path to commit suicide, and we're going to lose a lot of young children because of this. And we already have a dwindling population of, a dwindling birth rate here in Canada. That's just even more disastrous. The mentally ill as well, for the same reason. Because mentally ill, number one, they didn't give us specifications, but mentally ill can be people who suffer from absolute terrible mental diseases such as schizophrenia, or people who suffer from depression. And again, we're giving them access to suicide when this is exactly what a lot of these people want, when what they need is care. What they need is for people to look after them. Because if you can do that, if you can look after these people, you can give them a path to a better life. They're going to take that path, and they're not going to regret that decision. I know because I've seen it with people in my own life. Not me personally, but people very close to me, friends and family. I've seen how they've gone from the point of suicide to living a great life. So are we just then supposed to give them that path and not even give them the care that they need? Because most people, what they need is they need to sit down with a therapist or a psychologist, figure out where the problem is coming from, and then work through those problems. If you can work through those problems, you're golden. But instead, we're going to go for the easiest route and the most tragic route and just allow them to kill themselves. And let's not forget that suicide is a selfish act. Now, I don't agree with people when they say it's a cowardly act because it ain't easy to kill yourself, but definitely I agree with them when they say it's a selfish act because you have family, you have friends, you have people in your life that care and love you, and you're going to leave them all behind because you're going through a tough time right now. That is completely a selfish act and unacceptable. But instead of helping these families, helping everybody, they're just going to focus on the one person who's having a bit of a hard time and allow them to off themselves. So I hope this sort of thing doesn't go through. And this is also one of the big problems when it comes to... It's also one of the big problems I saw when they were talking about medically assisted suicide. When the Liberals came in and said that you should allow people to have medically assisted suicide, was the fact that it was not going to stay for terminally ill people, even though this is exactly what the Liberals were suggesting. They said, no, it's not for everybody. We're just going to give it to those who are already terminally ill, suffering from things such as cancer, and then we're going to leave it there. There's always going to be people that want to push the bar a little bit further. And this is exactly what we're seeing, and it's going to have tragic, tragic consequences. So this next thing I want to talk about, there's actually going to be two different stories, but they kind of play into a little bit. They're a little bit connected when it comes to the French language. So the first story is coming from this is from a politician in France. I'll admit that when I first saw it, I thought it was a politician from Quebec, but once I traced back who he was, I realized he was a politician from France. It was a member of the Green Party in France. And what he ended up saying was disgusting to say the least. And it just shows. Anyway, let's just get into it and you'll see what I mean. So this ended up coming from RT France. And so the article is in French, but I will translate for you. And we're not going to cover too much of the article, just the meaty parts of it. Climat. Limiter les naissances permettrait de mieux accueillir des immigrants, estime Yves Cochette. So what that is saying is that this French Green Party member, Yves Cochette, is suggesting that the French natives should limit the amount of births that they have so that they can better welcome in. They should limit the amount of French children that they have and better welcome in immigrants, and this will be a way of combating climate change. Now, the first problem with this is, well, you know what? Let's just quickly finish this up because I got only a couple things. Yves Cochette, the old deputy economic deputy and neo-Malthusian. A neo-Malthusian is somebody who believes that population will grow exponentially, but then resources such as food will grow at a steady rate. So pretty much you will pass the point where you will have more population than resources for them. He says that assumer développe des thèses censées relatir. He's talking about the development of this theory. L'enfondement de nos sociétés, par exemple, inverser la logique des allocations familiales afin notamment de mieux accueillir les immigrants. And that's exactly what he's saying there, is that you need to limit the amount of children you have, and in doing so, you can help welcome in more migrants. So pretty much he's suggesting you give more migrants more space for them while you limit your own children. And this is something that we've seen here in Canada too. I remember a while ago, the CBC put out an article that was talking about how we need, because climate change, that there's a carbon footprint that every human has. We need to limit the amount of children that we have. But then they're advocating to welcome in more immigrants, which is just counter to what they're talking about. They're saying, well, if we're talking about limiting our own carbon footprints, the carbon footprints that Canadians provide, then why would we have less children and then welcome in more immigrants, especially if these are immigrants who are going to bring in more children with them, have more children while they're here, expanding the population? It doesn't make sense. And the whole point of it is to combat climate change. This is the point that was in the CBC. This is exactly what this guy, Yves Cochette, is suggesting. So this is my problem with people, these sort of globalists, is that they're trying to say that we need less children and then more immigrants. Now the reason for this too is somebody like Yves Cochette, I don't know anything about him, but I don't believe that they are coming from the position I'm talking about. I believe that he's trying to do this to talk about immigrants, that he says he's coming from a place talking about climate and talking about the environment. First of all, we can't sacrifice the environment we can't sacrifice human beings over the environment. If we want to make real environmental changes, then go out and pick up trash. Go out and clean up the rivers. This is something that will help people. It will give us clean resources and clean water supplies for the future, which is exactly the type of thing that we need. But this is my problem with the globalists who suggest this. The reason that they want people to limit their amount of children and then bring in more immigrants is because it'll allow them to more easily take control of the people that are available. See, when you bring in more people from areas such as the Middle East, these are areas that typically have really oppressive governments, areas that have typically had dictators. And if you look at places such as where these dictators live, the people, the dictators and his close inner circle, they live pretty damn well while the rest of the population lives pretty terribly, and they're underneath the foot of the dictator. And this is something that the globalists want, is the fact that if they do this, our Western society has been built on fighting back against the government, and this has been seen throughout Western countries all over the world. that you have a vigilant population and you have people that are willing to fight back against a corrupt government. Now you limit those amount of people who will be vigilant, you limit the amount of people who are willing to fight back against a corrupt government, and you bring in people whose that was kind of always their culture and way of life. And then you can implement much more dictatorial powers without having to worry about them fighting back against you. It's a way for them to take over a nation and eventually take over the world without them actually having to fight back against the population. Also, the other thing is you're bringing in these people with lower IQs, which makes it a hell of a lot more difficult for them to fight back and be aware of the problems that we're facing. Now, the final story I want to talk about is showing how in Quebec there are what we can call snowflake politicians. And so, as you know, that on Boxing Day, this is when the World Juniors of Hockey end up taking place, where countries all over the world come together to battle it out with some of their best young talents in order to see who is the best in the world. Now, Quebec politician says criticism of Comtois is anti-Francophone racism. A Quebec politician says Instagram insults against Canadian World Junior Hockey Team captain Maxime Comtois are anti-Francophone racism. Parti Québécois interim leader Pascal Bérubé uses Twitter to share his feelings after Comtois was hit hard with criticism after missing on a penalty shot during overtime in a 2-1 loss in Finland in the World Junior Championship quarterfinals on Wednesday. This was the one that ended up getting Canada kicked out of the World Juniors. Several comments pointed out that the 19-year-old Comtois, a native of Longueuil, Quebec, is French. Commenting was disabled on recent pictures overnight, but some comments still remain Thursday morning. So, the leader of the Parti Québécois, Pascal Bérubé, is going on this idea that it's anti-French racism. Now, first of all, French is a language, not a race, so to say it's racism is wrong. What really pulled me towards this story was the fact that it reminded me a lot of the whole idea of Islamophobia. That if you speak out against Islam, if you're against Islam, then you're racist. You're guilty of Islamophobia. And this is kind of the same sort of play that they're using on this. And so I just think it's ridiculous. The thing is, people were pissed off because they want, we as Canadians perceive, especially our hockey teams, as being the best in the world. So when you have a hockey team that doesn't make it past, say, the quarterfinals, that loses in the quarterfinals, it really pisses a lot of people off. They didn't even win a medal. So people will take shots at anything that has to do with the guy because he's the captain of the team. It's his responsibility. But on top of that, he was the one taking the penalty shot. So they're taking shots at him because of it. So I just think that this is showing how the Parti Québécois are a bunch of snowflakes, simply because people are critical and bringing up the fact that he was French because of it. And they're using bullshit language like we see used by Islamists, saying, you're against Islam, you're a racist. They're doing the exact same thing, which is one of the reasons I do believe that when it comes to something like the Islamic Party of Ontario, the next one's going to be in Quebec, because they're going to play up on that. I've always said that Quebec is sort of like the California of Canada. Montreal's like the LA of Canada. And because of this is exactly where a group like that will flourish, because they have to play up on the poor us, we're oppressed idea. But this was just something I really wanted to cover here at the end. So that's all I really had for you all today. I hope that you all had a good new year and that 2019 turns out to be better than 2018 was, but we're not off to a great start quite yet, especially with this idea of the formation of the Islamic Party of Ontario. But we'll end up seeing what 2019 has to bring. I am still excited to see this year because it is an election year and it gives us an opportunity to vote Justin Trudeau out of office, which is something that we desperately need. So I want to thank you all for joining me on the True North Report. I'm your friendly neighborhood Knucklehead, and I'll be back soon with more stories that Canadians need to know.